Join former FBI senior forensic examiners Becky Passmore and Stacey Eldridge as they dig into the world of digital forensics, one bite at a time. Now leading their own consulting firms and educating the next generation of cyber sleuths. These badass babes of digital forensics bring sharp insight, real-world case experience, and a dose of humor to the bits and bytes that build today's investigations. From deep dives into business email compromise and ransomware attacks, Becky's specialty, to cracking the complexities of iPhone forensics, Stacey's obsession. This podcast delivers insider knowledge for professionals, students, and true crime techies alike. If you've ever wondered what really happens when the digital trail is all that's left, tune in and start parsing the truth.
Welcome back to Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time. I am Stacey, and I have my co-host, the beautiful Becky, with me tonight, as always.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. In this episode of Parsing the Truth, one bite at a time, we are going to explore how digital forensics shaped the narrative in the nationally watched case. Now, remember, we're not here to judge guilt or innocence, but just to highlight the critical role of process, methodology, and expert testimony. The testimony we're going to examine reveals how different forensic tools yielded different conflicting results. Also, the challenges of attributing actions on a shared device and how overlooked technical details like time zone shifts can alter the meaning of digital evidence. Our focus is on the principles that make digital forensics reliable in court, with cross-validation, attribution, contextual accuracy, and sound methodology.
In today's episode, we are analyzing the infamous Casey Anthony case, and it's from the digital forensics perspective. So that's what we're sticking to. Specifically, we're going to really focus in on the so-called chloroform searches and everything related to that and the forensic fallout that this caused.
So Stacey and I have been very lucky that we've been able to review the testimony of the forensic experts that were involved in this case, which were Sandra Osborne, Kevin Stinger, and John Bradley. We actually compared it to Cindy Anthony, which was Casey Anthony's mother's testimony. And it's clear, not all the stories line up. And so this episode is going to focus on the state's first two witnesses that were the digital forensic examiners. We also will have some upcoming episodes where we get to talk to some of these experts. So we're looking forward to that.
Before we dive in, let's talk just real quick about what we remember about this trial. So to level set, the disappearance occurred in 2000. Back in 2008, when this was all going on, I was actually TDY to the Tampa division working on some trial prep and going through a trial related to a terrorism case. So I remember like being there and hearing some of those guys talking about going to Orlando and having to go to the dump and dive through all the garbage there. But then when it came to the trial in 2011, obviously I knew it was happening, but I'm just not one to really track any of that stuff in the media. But obviously, after it was over, then I certainly heard about all of the things that happened related to the chloroform search and how that had rippling effects through the digital forensics community. What about you, Becky?
Yeah, I remember I was on vacation in Florida. My best friend lives in Florida, and I was there visiting her, and it was the talk of Florida. In fact, I believe I flew into Orlando, and it was just the big talk of everything. And everyone had their opinion. And I remember, all of the crowds that were around the courthouse and the television, and it was on every news channel. And it was just very publicized. And I just remember watching and listening to all the different stories that were coming out and thinking to myself, will we ever know the truth? Will we ever know the truth of what happened? And knowing that we have a court system that allows cases to go through the court, and what is said in the courtroom is how it's portrayed. And so that's what we're here to talk about.
Yes, we're strictly focusing on the testimony. We have done research outside of that, but we're going to keep our discussion to the testimony. And that's one of the things that people have to realize the media might say stuff. I know they were televising it and people could see like the sidebars, but the jury didn't get to hear the sidebar. So we're trying to break down the information as much as possible as it was given to the jury. And so to start it off, we're going to just get right into the witnesses. And I personally think the order of the witnesses was interesting because at first the prosecution, the state, calls 3 digital forensics experts in order, and it's Sandra Osborne, Kevin Stinger, both with the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and then John Bradley, who was a digital forensic examiner, but he also had his own company, and his company, him, produced this cashback software that's really relevant to this trial. And then it gets more interesting because the defense also calls Sandra Osborne and Kevin Stinger to testify for them. So not only did the prosecution call their own witnesses, but the defense calls 2 of those witnesses back to testify when it's their time for the direct. And they do this because they are using the state's original witnesses to introduce digital evidence that was not introduced through the state. And we'll try to dive into all of that as we approach it. We're going to try to take the testimony in order as much as we can.
Right. And so, as we said, we reviewed the testimony of those 3 forensic experts and also reviewed Cindy Anthony testimony. And there are some discrepancies, right? So we're going to explore these discrepancies and get to the root causes and the facts of the matter. We are approaching this, as we approach everything that we do, from the perspective of a dispassionate scientist, so we can learn from this case and we can share with others so they can learn from this case.
Absolutely. So let's start off with Detective Sandra Osborne, who testified first. She worked at the Orange County Sheriff's Office, and basically when she started working the case in 2008, she had been a CFCE certified through IASIS for about a year. And it sounds like that is about how long she had been in that position at that point, maybe a little longer to go through all of that process. But so let's think about 1 real year under your belt as a forensic examiner. And then by the time she testified in 2011, she would have had maybe another 3 years under her belt at that point. I thought her testimony was really great. She was very calm and very factual. She brought on her big, huge binder full of case notes and reports and stuff. So she was definitely prepared. And I thought she gave well thought out answers. Now, in this case, she is probably most known for finding the internet history that contained that infamous chloroform hit. But she actually did more than that.
Yeah, she also discovered 2 key pieces of evidence used by the prosecution.
What were those, Becky?
So there was a picture of Kaylee Anthony wearing a pink shirt with writing on it, and a video of Kaylee at a nursing home, which both of these were from Ricardo Morales's devices.
And I've seen some confusion on that. I've heard like it was the family camera that video was on. But from what we could tell in the testimony, they were talking about Morales's devices at that time. And this is where this was introduced. So we're going off of that testimony right now. But Becky, if you could tell us, why were these 2 pieces of evidence key in this case and key for her to find so they could be introduced?
Sure, absolutely. So the pink shirt is the same one that was found with Kaylee's body when she was found. And the video is the last evidence of Kaylee alive on June the 15th, the day before her disappearance.
And so this is important to bring these in because they're trying to, and by they, I mean the state is trying to have a specific narrative and they're working on a specific timeline. So they're like, here's the video. The date and time of this video is June 15th. This is the last day anybody has seen her alive. This is the day before she was reported missing.
They're trying to tie it together. They're trying to find anything that would correlate her last known location, her last items that she was wearing, and these pictures, or this picture and this video are going to help with that.
Now, one of the things Osborne does is she talks about checking the BIOS and the system date and time of that computer, of Morales's computer.
Right. And that is so important because when you have your BIOS, which is your basic input output system, date and time, that is the computer date and time. So being able to check the BIOS system date and time, and then when you're doing your analysis, compare it against all of the file system dates and times of the files on the computer. So if that's off, if the BIOS system date and time is off by an hour, then the files are going to be off. The file system files date and time is going to be off by an hour. And that's going to be critical in your analysis.
Right. Because if you are relying on dates and times, and you tend to do that in homicide cases, you better know if the dates and times and the time zone of that device is correct. Because if it's wrong and you don't know it, then it can ruin the entire case. And that especially happens if you didn't know and you built this timeline in this case, and then the other side finds out that all the dates and times were wrong.
But here's the thing. When you're working for the defense, you are relying on whoever did the forensic imaging of those computers. And so in this case, it was the Orange County Sheriff's Office who was able to check the times and report what they found.
And the other thing is you have to make sure that the lawyers know that the times are off too. If they are off, you got to make sure that they're clear, because again, they're building the narrative that they're going to use during the trial as well.
That's right. So let's talk about the chloroform hit and internet history that Osborne found.
So she testified that she found the chloroform hit in some sort of internet database file. She tried to figure out what type of file it was, if it was an internet database related to Internet Explorer or what exactly it was. She didn't have any luck, so she ended up calling her supervisor, Sergeant Stanger, over. Now, we need to mention that this hit for chloroform was found in unallocated space. So that means it wasn't recognized as being an active file that the user could interact with and see, and it wasn't even recognized as a deleted file. It's basically in some location on the hard drive that neither the file system or the operating system know about. And it wasn't like she was sure about where the start of the file was, especially since she wasn't sure what it was from exactly. And so based on the testimony, it sounds like Sergeant Stinger is the one who ultimately recovered it, and he testifies about that. Now, Becky, to put you on the spot, how would you manually recover this file or any file from unallocated space?
Well, and we've done this in IASIS. That is part of that process that you go through when you get certified. So you're trained very well in IASIS under the CFCE process. But we're going to look for header information. We're looking for headers. We're looking for information that would allow us to find a header and a footer of a file and carve it out. So we're going to carve it out of unallocated space. There's this thing as contiguous versus non-contiguous files. And basically, if you think of contiguous as meaning it's connected or it's touching something, like it is all in one place, that's going to be your contiguous file. Versus a non-contiguous file, it can be in different areas of a drive and with not connected. So in the context of that memory allocation or file allocation part, it means being able to know where the file is located and have the header and footer information to sweep and recover the data.
Right. And like our tools will go in and look for known file headers and footers when it's doing the data carving. And clearly this wasn't carved out as recoverable. And based on her testimony, I do think they did data carving as a whole on this case. And, it just wasn't carved out. And not everything is, but you've done that search hit and then you find it and you kind of look around in context and you're like, and you're seeing like URLs and you're like, well, this is something internet related, but I'm scrolling up and down. I can't seem to find the header or the footer of anything I know about. So you call over your boss and you're like, dude, what do you think? He looks through it and he's like, oh, yep, I see the header here. And then it sounds like he found the footer as well. But sometimes you can find some stuff in unallocated where you can kind of recognize what it is, but you don't have that header or maybe you're missing the footer, and you can still work with it, and you can kind of go and do a little bit of editing so it's nicely recognized, and put a header and a footer to work with it nicely, so you can parse it with another tool that might do a better job of pulling out all the records. There's certainly a call or a need for parsing out some stuff manually, but if you have like 1,000 records, you're probably not going to be able to do that manually. So you want to get it into a condition in which you can actually work with it and see if there's anything meaningful in here. Like, what is the context of chloroform showing up in here? That was very important to the case. So someone could have probably carved out that one record manually, but then it's like, okay, this has something that was meaningful to the case. What else is in there? What else should we look for?
Yeah, absolutely. And to put it in layman's term for our listeners that are maybe not as technical, you think of it as when you're looking at something in a general file system, it's going to look like a library where all the books are nicely and neatly placed together, right? You can go from book to book, just like you can go from file to file. Contiguous arrangement where you have to go and pull a book from one area and pull a book from another area. It's just scattered in different places. And that's what happens when data is not together, and you would have to recover it.
And the other thing that's important to know, especially as a digital forensic examiner, is how the file system and the operating system interact with this. Because I did mention earlier that the stuff in unallocated space, the file system and the operating system don't know about that. And so I think that's worth digging into. But to kind of do it like real down and dirty, right? Just high level stuff, is the operating system has access to the file system. And you as the user are using the operating system. That's the thing in between. And then the file system actually has access to the files itself. So your file system is your go-between between the operating system and the storage device, such as your hard drive, thumb drive, stuff like that. The file system has to be structured in such a way that the operating system can also recognize it and decide where to store and retrieve the files from.
Right. So that file system is going to act as an interface between that physical storage that you have on your computer and the operating system. And this interface, or this intermediary connection, makes it easier for the users and the applications that you have stored to be able to access the files without having to deal directly with hardware. So it just makes it more user-friendly for a user to access their files.
And there's sometimes a common misconception, like when you see that black screen, a terminal or a command prompt, and people are just typing, like that's the file system. It's not. It's still a go-between between yourself and the file system. That is not the file system. Now, Sandra's testimony wasn't really too terribly long. And the only thing interesting that comes up during the cross, and this is my opinion, that is the only interesting thing that comes up, was a nice discussion on how keyword searches works. But it's not discussed in any detail until the redirect. She's asked about searching for chloroform on Ricardo Morales's computer, and there's some back and forth, and she goes in there. She's like, I specifically stated in my report that I didn't find any web pages or pictures referencing chloroform on his computer.
Yeah. And then the defense asks her if she's seen a specific picture. And she says yes, and eventually describes it as a man and a woman. A woman is sitting in a chair, apparently dining in a black evening gown. The man is looking over her shoulder with a white cloth in his hand, reaching around behind her shoulder, and it has the words, "Win her over with chloroform." Now, how is that possible, Stacey?
How is that possible that she didn't find it? Well, the state is quick to clap back on that, on the redirect, because the defense has everybody thinking like, oh my God, there's this picture and she didn't find it. And she's like, because it's known to exist. And this is where it's get interesting, is they're going back to the keyword searches, and the state is asking if the pixels embedded in a picture are accessible in a keyword search. And she explains that they're not, because they are pixelated and they are represented as hexadecimal in that picture when you're looking at it in the computer language, and it just looks jumbled up.
Right. And so the picture was posted on Morales's MySpace page. Now we're going way back when we're talking about MySpace.
Right. Remember, 14 years ago, too.
Exactly.
So that's like some of that fancy searching we get now when we're trying to find something in a picture. We don't have none of that.
Right. So it seems the defense is trying to introduce doubt to imply that Osborne didn't find it because it wasn't keyword searchable. But that doesn't negate the ability to look through all the pictures and still find a match. Based on her testimony, it sounds like this is what she did.
So let's move on to the state's second witness. That's a digital forensic examiner. Who is that, Becky?
Yeah, so that was Sergeant Kevin Stanger, who is a sergeant of the computer crimes at the Orange County Sheriff's Office. No surprises here that his testimony starts off regarding the recovery of that internet history file containing the chloroform hit that Osborne testified about earlier. He goes on to explain it was in unallocated space, as we already discussed a little earlier. He further explains that most know when it's deleted, it's not really deleted. Then uses the good old card catalog example that we've all used in the past to explain.
Yep. 14 years ago, we were using that.
Exactly. That's right. And I kind of just used it a few minutes ago, like the books are scattered all around. So Stacy, could you still use that card catalog analogy example today to help explain deleted versus unallocated?
I mean, you'd have to look at the people sitting in the jury next to you in the courtroom, but I think it's probably a little outdated today, because even if you do go in that library, which is still full of physical books, you are not, well, at least around here, I've not seen any physical card catalogs that you can go thumbing through. So today, I think we can still relate it to books, but I think perhaps a better example would be using an index of a book, perhaps, because then you could, do the example like, well, see, here's all the pages of the book. Everything's still written. But then when I rip out the index, you could even use the table of context as well. But, the index gives you a lot more specific things. So that's why I like to use the index. So you could still rip out one page of the index, or you could black out with a marker, maybe some specific keywords of the index. But that information is still going to be there as you flip through the book. You just don't know how to find it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you could even go to the filing cabinet and have organized in the filing cabinet by the different files, and the master file that indicates what all files are in that file cabinet is missing. But all those file folders are still in that filing cabinet. You can still get to the data. You just don't have the master file telling you what is in which filing cabinet.
Yeah. Great example.
So he also reveals that they recovered a MORC database for Mozilla Firefox.
The MORC database was a horrible database.
It was.
So let's talk next about why that MORC database was just so awful.
So it is a text-based, but it's not human readable. Former Netscape engineer, and I'm going to mess up his last name, but Jamie Zawinski has called it the single most brain damaged file format that I have ever seen in my 19th year career. And so that was actually written in Mozilla's Bugzilla report in 2004.
Well, and some other people might be like, well, why is a former Netscape engineer talking about Mozilla? Well, if we jump further back in time, there was the browser wars.
Right.
And if you want to know more about the browsers wars, there was a show on AMC called Halt and Catch Fire, and they go through all of that sort of stuff. But basically, Netscape, as they lost, eventually became Mozilla and Firefox. So that's where that comes in, why he's talking about. And so my thoughts are initially, without looking into anything, if somebody's saying it's brain damage, it's probably going to be hard to parse. And it actually is. It's not even efficient when storing the Unicode text because it still takes 3 to 6 bytes per character. So that's a lot of overhead right there. And if you guys are interested in more on seeing how this is parsed out and just how problematic it is, you can head over to digital-detective.net. They are the folks that produce Net Analysis, and they actually have a really great write-up breaking down, parsing this MORC database that was from this case. And I'm going to read to you what they say here, just because I think it's important. I'm going to read it word for word. So Digital Detective describes the basic MORC content model is a table, or also known as a sparse matrix. And it's composed of rows containing cells, where each cell is a member of exactly one column. But each cell is one attribute in a row. The name of the attribute is a literal designating the column, and the content of the attribute is the value. The content of the cell is either a literal or a reference, and each reference points to a literal or a row or a table. So a cell can contain another shared object by reference. Becky, did your head just explode trying to follow that?
Yes. And if I was a forensic examiner and knew back then that I had to parse something like that or try to even understand it, I don't know that I would be doing what I'm doing today.
Well, I just would have been like, boss, I need some money to buy this tool called Net Analysis so my head doesn't explode and you don't have to find a new examiner.
That's right.
But again, head over to digital-detective.net to see more about that. We're not going to try to walk you through that any more than we just did on this episode, or ever.
So back to the testimony. Stingers asked how he recovered it. He was asked how he recovered it. And he explains he used the header and the footer, which was what we were talking about earlier. You identify a header of a file and the footer, and you can recover it. But the header began with MORC. Once he identified, he then manually recovered it using a forensic tool called EnCase. So what he's doing here is he's going through his file structure and identifying the header of that database, and then sweeping through the sectors and the clusters that he needs to tie it all back together, finding the footer, and then exporting it out using EnCase in this situation. So Stacy, he's got it recovered. Why is this file so contentious in this case?
Stinger states in his testimony that the trouble was with the fact that this internet history file crossed daylight savings, and it contained the dates of March 4th through 1st in 2008, and that's why he ended up using cashback. He created 2 cashback reports, one for March 17th and one for March 21st, because those dates had hits for chloroform. Now, we did go back and look up when was daylight savings time starting in 2008, and it started on March 8th. Now, the reports that he generated, the 17th and the 21st, weren't on the daylight savings time date change. Now, why do you think this is a big deal, Becky?
Well, obviously, when you are adjusting, again, we're talking about BIOS time, basic input-output system. You have your BIOS date and time. If the system does not adjust to the daylight savings time, that's going to indicate 1 hour difference. And if that was not indicating as daylight savings time, current daylight savings time, and it's referencing before daylight savings time adjustment, the file time is going to be off.
And the other thing is, in 2007, they started doing the daylight savings time earlier. So it started 4 weeks earlier, just 1 year before that. And so if you didn't have all of your updates and patches applied to your computer might not automatically update like it should. So your times might be off for a month.
Yeah. So how could you account for that, Stacy?
Well, as the forensic examiner, you could go in and check the update / the patch level of the Windows operating system, and then go back and cross-reference that with what Microsoft said you needed to have, or where you needed to be at in terms of those updates and patches, to make sure that you wouldn't have any issues for those 4 weeks. Now, is there anything else that you can think of, Becky, that might pose an issue with these time changes and daylight saving time?
Well, I mean, obviously programs. So in this situation, Stanger reports that net analysis didn't handle daylight savings time. So we checked, and net analysis even verified that the version at the time the Stinger was using, 1.37, had no option to present the timestamp as a local value adjusted for daylight savings time. Only did the standard time.
And so maybe if enough of us forensic examiners write to our Congress people, we can just get rid of daylight savings time so we have one less thing to deal with in terms of the problems of time.
That's correct. That's correct.
Is there any way to compensate for net analysis inability to do the daylight savings time?
So you could add a column in the report to reflect the correct time, which now, as experienced examiners, you find ways to adjust and make things reflect correctly without modifying anything. So you could add a column in the report to reflect the correct time, but I can see where you'd want one tool doing everything correctly without having to make any of those changes.
And the testimony never revealed one way or another if the computer was on the appropriate patch level or not. I'm not surprised this didn't come up, but we want to know, right?
Of course.
That's not the way testimony works. And the digital forensic examiners don't get to say whatever they want. They got to answer questions. But anyways, I was thinking, would it have been appropriate to only produce net analysis reports for March 17th and March 21st, since those were the only 2 dates with activity concern, and those were the only 2 dates introduced in court? You could just easily be like, here's the adjustment, and be done.
And you could try to only produce those 2 dates and those 2 reports, but you'd certainly have to be aware that the defense could ask about all the other dates and ask why reports weren't created, produced, or introduced for the remaining dates. The defense could go even further as to imply that the state was trying to hide exculpatory information, which would then probably add even more reasonable doubt to the jurors.
Yeah. So I think when you explain it like that, it makes sense about why Stanger would be looking for a tool that could handle the daylight savings times natively. Becky, let's discuss, as we already hinted to, why times are a pain and how to handle explaining times, especially when you're doing it in the courtroom.
Yeah, absolutely. There's standard time, there's daylight savings time, there's UTC time. Some programs and and information represents it as GMT time. There's 12-hour versus 24-hour clocks. And then there's, what is your tool doing? And then, do you need to go in there and manually parse out the file system, hex file, throw it into a calculator, and manually convert it to a date and time using decode? There's so many different ways that dates and times are affected in what we do.
Yeah, and then it gets worse because it's like, what time zone is your evidence in? What time zone is it from? What time zone are you sitting in? And having to adjust for that, and especially at this time frame. I was not an NCASE user, so I can't speak to that. But in FTK, it was such a pain in the butt. And there was, even though we talked about it a lot in the FBI, it was still like, okay, you want me to do what with my exam machine? Can I compensate for it in the tool? So it was always like, find a known thing and then make sure like the times and dates are matching. So like, that's where like correlation to something else can be really helpful. Just don't be like, I'm going to look only on this one thing on the computer. Is there anything else that people have from something else where we know the time and we can make sure that this is all correct and being processed correct, and we're not going to be totally wrong about everything in this case that relates to date and time?
Absolutely. And then you have to go back to, was it downloaded? What was the original date and time of that file before it was downloaded? Was it copied and pasted from one location to another location? Because then that starts to adjust those various time frames and what those times and dates and what they mean. And so I think these are some just really good points for everyone to keep in mind when it comes to times, that don't just rely on one situation and one file and one date and time, because there is going to be something that could adjust that, and it could put you in a corner when having to communicate about dates and times.
Yep. And at this point in his testimony, Stinger concludes by stating that he gave that same MORC file, that database that he recovered, to John Bradley and asked him if he could get cash back to parse it out. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the Bradley testimony coming up later.
Yeah. And so now we move on to the Stinger testimony crossed by the defense. And the defense has Stinger confirm that the Firefox Internet History file was a deleted file, and that he didn't know when it was deleted. And people do delete when their computer is running slow.
And at this point, he gets into a little bit of like what information was in that MORC database with the internet history. And he's talked about how long some of the site visits were to some different sites, specifically the one mentioning chloroform. He says it's about 10 seconds before the user goes on to MySpace. And he also states that he doesn't know what is on that chloroform site because they were not able to recreate the page.
Yeah, and he's also asked about the when. He's also asked about the when or her over the chloroform picture that was on Morales' MySpace, and Stinger is also aware of it. So he's asked about this, and he confirms and acknowledges that he's aware of it.
And so I wonder if during this, the defense is trying to introduce more doubt by bringing this up again and asking if he's aware that it's on Morales' MySpace page.
Yeah, so Stinger clarifies on redirect that cashback can only rebuild pages from unallocated space.
Yeah, so the state is demonstrating like we didn't just do this halfway. We could not do it. The defense wrapped up Stinger's testimony, and at this point, Stinger has only gotten in his cashback reports as exhibits from March 17th and March 21st. The state didn't ask him anything about those reports, only the defense did. All they did was get it in as evidence or as an exhibit, and I thought that was a little interesting.
So Osborne and Stinger have each testified once. At this point, they still haven't gotten into the 84 times that the chloroform site has been visited. Stinger has only discussed how long the user was on the site before moving on to the next website.
And we'll get to the 84 times in the next episode.
Until then, stay safe, stay sharp, and as always, keep parsing the truth one bite at a time.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow us to get notified the next time a new episode drops. If you can do more, head on over to parsingthetruth.com and donate by clicking on the donate button. Parsing the Truth is a nonprofit organization, and we are raising money to send a new digital forensic examiner to IASIS training next year in Orlando. Thanks.